Soren Reeves, an elderly Asian fisherman, spent 60 years traveling the same coastal waters, his calloused hands hauling nets that were loaded with the wealth of the ocean. However, nothing in his long and peaceful existence could have adequately prepared him for what he discovered on that beach in the middle of nowhere. The morning was exceptionally quiet as Soren navigated his dilapidated boat close to a rocky outcrop, which was a location that the locals avoided because of the dangerous currents that flowed through it. But in the sunshine, there was something that glowed in an unnatural way, a peculiar dome-like object that was partially hidden in the sand. In the first, he thought it was nothing more than a rock that had been rounded off by the waves. However, instinct, the same instinct that had led him through storms and seasons that were sparse, urged him to explore it more. He was unable to catch his breath as he made his way onshore to the coast. In no way was it a rock. It was a shell, a massive clam that seemed to have been there for a very long time. The surface of the shell was inscribed with bizarre swirling patterns that appeared to be almost planned. In the past, he had seen gigantic clams, but nothing quite like this one. This object was about the size of a small barrel, and its edges were welded together as if time itself had sealed them shut. With a racing heart, Soren dialed the number of his longtime buddy June, the one person he really trusted with such a finding. Together, using chisels and crowbars, they worked cautiously, prying at the seam of the shell that was resistant to being removed. There was a palpable sense of salt and expectation in the air. After then, there was a crack. A crack appeared in the shell. As he stumbled backward, Jun crossed his right arm. It was almost as if Soren's knees gave out. From the inside, tucked away in the pearly skin of the clam, there was a pearl, but it was not any old pearl. The surface of it was gleaming with an unreal cream color, and it was shot through with veins of gold and blue. It was enormous, the size of a man's fist. It had a slight pulse, like if it were alive. A hushed voice said by Jen, This isn't natural." Soren extended his hand. His fingers shook with fear. Soon as he made contact with it, a peculiar sensation crept throughout his fingers. And for the tiniest fraction of a second, he heard something a whisper, similar to the distant murmur of the sea. After wrapping the pearl in burlap and rushing to the authorities, they were terrified, yet elated. They were afraid that thieves, or worse, would take the pearl. The specialists at the museum let out a gasp. In addition to being the biggest pearl ever documented, its composition was inexplicable to scientific researchers. They were supposed to be gifts from the sea gods, bearing blessings or curses, and were referred to as the tears of the ocean in legends. There was a rapid diffusion of the news. The fortunes were offered by collectors, historians, and even mystics who attended to the event. To Soren, however, who was a simple guy who had spent his life according to the tides, this was more than just a stroke of luck. He had been selected by the pearl. After all was said and done, he sold it to the museum for $8 million, which ensured that it would be preserved. However, money was not the factor that brought about his transformation. Over the course of the subsequent nights, Soren had dreams about the depths of the ocean, civilizations built of coral, and voices screaming his name. And on occasion, when the moon was full, he would go back to that remote beach and wait for the ocean to speak once again as he listened to it. For the pearl was more than simply a valuable possession. It was a message that was sent. Furthermore, Soren Reeves was now the custodian of it. Even though Soren Reeves was now living in luxury, his thoughts was becoming more restless as the weeks grew into months. It was not in words, but in images, that the whispering in his nightmares became more audible. It was a great and ancient shadow that moved under the ocean, and he saw towering waves that were swallowing up coastlines, ships that were being carried into the abyss. In the midst of a stormy evening, an elderly lady showed up at his door as the rain pounded on the window of his home. Her eyes were milky from cataracts, and her skin was leathery from the sun, yet she stood straight and unbent by the passage of time. As she spoke, her voice was like shifting sand. "You have awakened it," she was saying. "The pearl of eternal tides is not something that should be displayed in a museum. It is the property of the deep." Blood began to run cold in Soren. She was known as Madame Leora, the sea witch of the eastern shoals, and he had heard stories about her. The fisherman whispered about her, believing that she had the power to call forth storms and communicate with the spirits of those who had perished. Inquiring, "What have I awakened?" he said forth. When she smiled, her teeth seemed to be pieces of cracked shells. The colossal Leviathan, one who watches over the cavern. At a time when humanity still feared the fury of the ocean, the pearl was its eye, and it was carefully extracted. It is now beginning to stir. The earth began to shake, as if it had been compelled by her words. The sound was not thunder, but rather a deep, resonant moan that seemed to come from a tremendous distance below, as if the ground itself were breaking apart. On the horizon was the sea. That then Soren realized that his good fortune was not a gift. It was a strong warning. A panicked phone came in from the museum the next morning, informing them that the pearl had disappeared overnight. With its display case smashed from the inside out, the pearl was lying in a puddle of seawater on Soren's doorstep after it had been there for some time. It is pulsing. We're waiting. In the murky light of the dawn, Soren found himself staring at the pearl, which had golden veins that shimmered like liquid fire. There was a whiff of brine in the air, along with something older-looking and alive. The museum had not been the only place where the pearl had been taken, because it had come back to him. The warning that Madame Leora had given him reverberated in his head. It belongs to the deep. The pearl was lifted by him with hands that were trembling. Immediately, when his fingertips made touch with the surface, the images came to him like a tsunami. There is darkness. There is pressure. A pit that is crushing. The eyes came next. Magnificent, slit-pumped, and blazing like stars that had been submerged in the void of infinity. They were able to see him. They understood him. A gasp from Soren's mouth as he dropped the pearl upon the table. There was a single roll, and then it settled down, humming softly. Evening of that day, the first reports began to arrive. Something that trailed the hulls of fishing boats for kilometers before disappearing into the depths was the source of the terror that sent out radio. Transmissions from fishing vessels off the coast of the northern United States. Images captured by sonar revealed a form that was too huge to be a whale, and its motions were methodical and circular. Even the ocean itself seemed to be agitated. Unpredictably, the ocean's tides rose. The whales seemed to be running away from the shore. The peasants who lived along the shore said that they heard a sound in the middle of the night. It was a deep, echoing tone that sounded like a huge conch shell being blown from the depths. It was clear to Soren what had to be done. At daybreak, he loaded his ancient fishing boat with food, placed the pearl in a backpack made of oiled leather, and started off on his journey. He was not trying to escape, but rather to come back. A scribbled map with its edges discolored with seawater had been left for him by Madame Leora. The map indicated a location known as the point where the continental shelf disappeared into oblivion. There is a deep well of hungry spirits. When he pressed the pearl to his chest, it became warmer as his boat navigated over the waves. Words, a language that is older than humanity and is whispered in the fractures of the earth, returned to the whispers, which were no longer dreams but words as well. You carry my heart, fisherman. The voice was the very depths of the ocean. Taking a glance over the edge of the boat, Soren gazed. It was very dark, and the water was too motionless. At that moment, something gently emerged from the depths. It was a massive scaled lid that slowly fell back to show an eye that was the size of his boat. There was a leviathan lying in wait.